Alright, here we're going to do a little bit of a change of pace. I'm going to be looking at the relationship of comic books to philosophy as well as cinematic culture. And I'm going to be examining the work of Mignola, or Mignola, if you're Italian, and especially his creation Hellboy. I'm going to start with the early influences on Michael's work and then trot into, of course, Hellboy and his impact on modern culture. Because I've been looking at fascism, but now we want to look also at anti-fascism and how that's portrayed in visual media. So Mike is an interesting example of a transition period because when he was growing up there was still some, but not a lot, of work done in the fantasy genre, and that's really where he owes his most immediate influences to. I mean, you have somebody like Jack Kirby who was always in between those two worlds. On the one hand, he created Captain America, which is kind of a paradigm of the superhero, but he also did work that was really much more zany and fantasy-filled. Although Mike has always been clear that his most major influences have been other fantasy artists, but there's a very clear direct line from Kirby to him before the superhero became so dominant and hegemonic in the 1980s, which is when he really started working. But if you look at his career as a whole, it's not just his so-called superhero stuff. He's also done work on Dracula and kind of these other mythological creatures. And so he takes a lot from the fantasy artist's perspective that it's not about realism. It's not really about portraying people in these kind of superhero poses or these superhero muscles. It's really about getting an effect through to the reader depending on what the situation is. I'd also highly recommend his work on Batman, which is also very much, again, trying to give the reader a sort of experience of being in a fantasy space. But there's no doubt his most famous creation, and it's very ironic in many ways because Hellboy is probably one of the very few actual American myths. Almost all American myths are really borrowed from other countries or other times and places, but Hellboy is about America, and in particular in a certain way of understanding the anti-Nazi cause from World War II. And again, that's another Kirby nod, right? Because Captain America was a very anti-Nazi symbol. And there is something real there. There is an actual real literature on the occult and the Nazis and how the Nazis were fascinated with mysticism and tapping into these dark satanic powers. So he is tapping into a real history. So I don't want to say that this is all just gobbledygook or just made up. Michael does serious research whenever he does Hellboy, and he does drop these fascinating links between Satanism and the Nazis. But I think that's the ultimate dilemma with Hellboy. On the one hand, it's interesting how he is literally fighting the Nazis and Hitler and these creatures and monsters that the Third Reich created in the post-war years. But he's not actually fighting contemporary forms of Nazis, whether neo-Nazis or the KKK. Well, but, you know, those aren't the primary targets. He sometimes does, quote-unquote, take on right-wing figures, but Hellboy is, to me, sort of a weird example of both an aesthetic triumph, but a kind of a political failure, because, again, the real story of the Nazis is that they were very much remaining in power, not just in Germany, but in other countries, and were often protected by various governments in Central America and South America, as well as Europe. And there's a long literature on this. So yes, it's true that the Nazis were into mysticism and Satanism and all these other things, though how much Hitler actually believed this, we don't know. We have contradictory accounts. And so it's perfectly legitimate that Michael just wants to focus on that aspect, the kind of fantasy aspect that the Nazis engaged in, right? The Spear of Destiny and all these other things. And he's not the only one. There have been other kind of interesting attempts to tackle that issue. But I think it really does a bad job of narrowing the scope of how wide Nazism was, as well as kind of distorting the belief that anti-fascism was as popular as he thinks it was. It was a lot smaller than I think he wants to believe in the post-war years. So again, a fascinating way of doing American mythologies, and again, if you look at the work carefully, mostly Hellboy works outside of America, so I don't know if this was an intentional thing, but yeah, it's weird how Hellboy just is sort of weirdly apolitical in effect, if not by design. But a very fascinating creation, and continuing this legacy that's been sort of forgotten about the fantasy books as well as horror comic books that were once prevalent in the 1940s and 50s before the censorship regime and McCarthyism stepped in. Alright, this has been Partially Examined Kubrick on the dilemmas of representing anti-fascism in post-war American culture in comic books. Partially Examined Kubrick. If you like the content, please hit the like button and or subscribe. Thank you for listening. Please be safe.